I wondered what it suggests about the relations between the leading members of Reform UK.
Islamism and Palestinian activism and hard left activism together are resurgent, and our government just don't know what to do. I'm tempted to say to any criminals listening, if you want to evade jail, then just make sure that you say, "This is for Palestine," as you're committing the crime. Hello and welcome to the Spectator's podcast, Quite Right. I'm Michael Gove, editor of The Spectator.
And I'm Madeline Grant, assistant editor and parliamentary sketchwriter.
And this week we'll be discussing the reform reshuffle as Nigel Farage unveils his fantastic four of shadow ministers whom he hopes will enhance the credibility of his bid for government. And the government's own woes. We'll be looking at the court's decision to uphold an appeal from the activist group Palestine Action that when the government tried to prescribe them, the government were in the wrong. Whose side do we take?
We'll also be discussing the life and legacy of Kenneth Williams on the centenary of his birth, which lands this week. So we just heard in the last few minutes that Reform UK have announced their shadow cabinet, or at least part of their shadow cabinet. So we've heard that Robert Jenrick would be their Chancellor of the Exchequer, Zia Youssef, their Home Secretary. Richard Tice would have a job that, interestingly, they plan to incorporate Business Secretary and Energy together, which I think actually makes a lot of sense, and that job would be done by Richard Tice. Lee Anderson would be Chief Whip, and Suella Braverman would be the Skills, Education and Equalities Brief. So although they have more MPs than that, these are what we've heard so far, and there's no appointment for Foreign Secretary that has been made just yet. Michael, what do you make of the appointments we've heard about so far?
There's a logic to them. So the first thing is Nigel Farage knows that one of the principal concerns that people have is that reform is a one-man band, that in Dominic Cummings' phrase, it's Nigel and his smartphone, and the reform defections that have occurred from the Conservatives, we've been promised a Labour defection that may yet come, but they've been principally from the Conservatives so far, have generally been about destabilising the Tories, and they've often come at moments which have been designed to destabilise the Conservatives. What today is an attempt to say, actually, these defections are evidence that we have people experienced in government and in business who you can imagine can take on these roles and who are proof that the defections were not simply about Westminster Games, they would argue, but about assembling a team capable of governing this country. And as I say, there is a logic to each of those. So Robert Jenrick has been in the cabinet and was undoubtedly the shadow cabinet's, one of the shadow cabinet's deftest performers before he defected. Suella Braverman has been both Home Secretary and Attorney General and was involved in the establishment of one of the best schools in the country, the Michaela Free School. Richard Tice has a business career and has made a study of energy, hasn't always got some of the details right in the past, but then it's a learning curve in that particularly dense policy area. And Zia Youssef, as well as having a very successful business career, was also the principal architect of the deportation policy that was a significant highlight for reform in their advance in the polls last year. It comes, of course, against the backdrop of reform apparently stalling in the opinion polls. And as we noted last week, Kemi Badenoch making the running in the Commons. So it's both, I think, an attempt to tell a new story or a renewed story about reform and also to make the most of the personnel at their disposal.
I wondered about what it suggests about the relations between the leading members of Reform UK. I was a little surprised when it was trailed that Robert Jenrick would be Chancellor of the Exchequer. I mean, I suspect that his defection, probably the price of that was to be Chancellor. But generally, I haven't heard Robert Jenrick intervening that much on the economy. If anything, I've heard more of that from Zia Youssef, who has a background in business. And I know that he was heading up the deportations, but that felt more like a natural fit for Robert Jenrick. And I wondered if maybe Jenrick has concluded that the Home Secretary's job is just a horrible job in politics and almost no one manages to make a success of it. So to do the running in a different department. But then if this is the case, and obviously this is my own speculation, but Zia Youssef is a man who channels an extraordinary amount of energy and a lot of his own money into Reform UK. So to be sidelined in favour of Robert Jenrick And it's known that Zia Yusuf has been privately sceptical of just the sheer number of ex-Tories that they're attracting. So I wonder if that might be, storing up some tension for the future.
I think that's true. Rob Jenrick has been a Treasury Minister, and it was also the case that the principal cabinet role that he had as Secretary of State at Housing, Communities and Local Government had a significant economic dimension. He was responsible, for example, for liberalising some of the regulations around businesses to enable them to survive during COVID. And of course, he was the architect of some quite radical planning reforms, which in the end, Boris sort of retreated on. Well, didn't
yes.
sort of, Boris did
yes.
retreat on. So he does have economic credentials. I think it's because A, he's in the Commons, B, he's the biggest prize in terms of defections so far, and C, I think I have to acknowledge it's a moot point. Is he a better communicator than Zia Yusuf? I don't know, because he is really good on social media. So he edges
and really good on TV as well, actually.
Yeah.
I think he's good at making arguments that you don't hear other politicians making very easily about the economy in particular.
Yeah, Zia Yusuf is good. I mean,
and persuading people, because I think there's been a real absence of that in politics recently, where I think often politics is governed by, let's do the focus group, let's do the polling first, and then we work from there.
Yeah.
This idea that you might actually be able to win people around and convince people of stuff by arguing in the public's realm that's felt like it has retreated somewhat in recent decades.
I think that's true, but I think it's probably more the case that because Rob's in the Commons and because he has that direct ministerial experience that Nigel Farage has made this judgment. But it does raise the question, again, of the succession struggle within reform. I know it may seem premature when within the party, as it has been within all of the parties he's led or even been in, that Nigel Farage is the king, and the others are members of his court. So, whether or not you're Cromwell or Wolsey, there's no mistaking the fact that he's Henry VIII. So it may be, nevertheless, that the rivalry for the future between Zia and Rob is sharpened by this judgment. But for the moment, I'm sure that they recognise that what they need to do is to produce a level of coherence to a future programme for government. Because shadow chancellor, shadow business, shadow education, they're not jobs, they're roles. So it's not the case that you are pulling levers, you are developing policies, ideas, building teams, preparing for government. And there is a big credibility question that reform has to answer, because they're not completely unacquainted with government now. Their record in local government so far has been disappointing. Not that they've presided over grotesque disasters, so far as I'm aware, but it's certainly the case that the promise that a Doge-style efficiency drive would lead to significant savings in the operation of reform councils has not been proven. And, I'm sure from your experience in Warwickshire that, despite their best efforts, that the Reform Council there has run into all sorts of difficulties. So I'm not saying that they're democratic black spots, but I am saying that the need for reform to prove that they can be effective in administration is greater, perhaps, than for other parties.
I think there's actually probably more of a failure of comms there than a failure of actual government governance. Anyone who knows the first thing about local government knows that the vast amount of local funding is actually tied up with specific obligations, statutory obligations with social care and with SEND that saps up almost all of the funding. So the fact that they promised Doge without realising that given the statutory obligations that would be nigh on impossible to deliver suggests just a basic amateurism and a lack of understanding of what they were entering into.
Again, it may well be the case that this is a learning experience, a series of teachable moments that reinforce the need for them to prepare more effectively for government. And that preparation for government, some might say, is a distraction from campaigning. But my own view, I'm biased, is that the more credible you appear as a government, the more willingly people will cast their votes for you in whichever electoral contest there are. And of course, there will be more electoral contests.
Yeah.
Some of the local elections that the government wished to cancel are now back on, thanks to Nigel Farage challenging the government in court. There's a minor irony that the courts have overturned a democratic majority in Parliament in their decisions. Well, actually, the courts haven't overturned. The government have caved on the basis of their legal advice. But nevertheless, you have to account it a clear win for Nigel. It's a double win.
Yeah.
He's standing up for democracy and humiliating the government, but it's also the case that he's unlocking more potential gains, the way things are looking, for reform in these local elections, because many of the elections that will come about in areas like Norfolk and Suffolk are in areas where reform appear to be resurgent. They're stronger generally, they're not always, along the east coast of England. So that will definitely be a fillip for reform at the moment.
Isn't it also, just from a very basic hubristic level, rather beautiful to see the king of lawfare himself being undone by other people's lawfare?
Yes, quite.
It's glorious. I mean, I wrote a piece about this a few weeks ago in the magazine. Basically, you could not have a clearer example of someone being hoisted by their own petard. So I think we can enjoy that for what it is, regardless of your political affiliation.
Totally. And on the whole, may seem ironic for me as an ex-politician and a member of the House of Lords, but more elections rather than fewer. The more elections, the better. And I know that the elections are supposed to be for zombie councils that are only in place for a year. But I think that on this one, fair play to Farage, as we reflect on the team that he's assembled as well to capitalise on this moment for him, I do think the most interesting, because obviously least predicted appointment to a new role is Suella. It's signalled that education, skills and equalities should be considered a great office of state. That was Tony Blair's view, funnily enough, when he appointed David Blunkett as Education Secretary.
Yeah.
He thought that Education Secretary should be considered in that way. Naturally, as a former Education Secretary myself, this is a view that I wholeheartedly endorse. But when it comes to developing education policy, there will be, I think, all sorts of fascinating questions that Suella will face. So we know that Reform have said that they're against the tax rate on independent schools, and that in particular, Suella today, I think, had a go at the adoption of regulations and guidance on transitioning children in schools. Both of those, I'm sure, will go down well with the Reform base. And I think she also had a go at the 50% university participation target, which I don't think anyone now defends apart from Tony Blair. So these are relatively easy hits.
Until his son has a word with him.
Well, quite.
His son, who's made tens of millions of pounds by pursuing apprenticeships and promoting them with companies. Amazing.
And I was going to say, well, you know, that's all very well. Those are easy hits, but the real work of detail is more profound than that. But maybe just scoring those easy hits will be enough for the moment. So do you think that Suella needs to flesh out in much greater detail what a reform education vision might be?
Oh, absolutely. I suppose part of the virtue of assigning people's jobs and assigning them publicly is that it then does create some public accountability for what they're trying to do. The expectation now will be, I guess, that all of the people who've been assigned their jobs will now be specialising in that brief and coming forward with new ideas. In a way, it's a subtle kick up the backside, I suppose, for these individuals. You know, now the heat is on because people know that this is all on you. Interesting that Danny Kruger is still yet to be assigned a kind of public-facing job. His role seems to be working in the realm of
policy formation,
but also constitutional. How do you reverse some of the Blair-era vandalism that has made it difficult to govern? What to do about the civil service? This has not yet been assigned in a ministerial capacity, but it's obviously a very, very important job. But maybe they figure that with someone like Danny Kruger, he needs to be left alone to get on with what he's doing behind the scenes.
I think that's right. I think that Zia being the Shadow Home Secretary will mean that the effective sort of policy coordination role will be de jure Danny Kruger's, as it has been essentially de facto And part of his responsibility will be to make sure that within Reform, the fact that they've recruited, I think, 20 new people to their staff recently, that making the most of that, and also working with the think tanks that have shown a willingness to generate ideas for a reform or reform their government, institutions like the Prosperity Institute, the Centre for a Better Britain, and of course the work of the academic James Orr at Cambridge University, who's been involved in these things. Again, it will be interesting to see. But Reform will also face an electoral test next week with the Gorton and Denton by-election, when their paladin Matt Goodwin will come up against the Labour machine and the Green surge. So it may be that Reform's momentum generated by the legal victory and by the unveiling of this team may be checked in the Northwest. It will be interesting to see. But if Reform win that by-election, then that gives them the perfect launchpad for the local election campaign.
I think some on the left are guilty of a kind of motivated reasoning with Reform UK, where they so don't want it to happen that they look for any evidence that the tidal wave has been repressed. I do think by-elections can be a bit special, a bit different. You're more likely to get a kind of rally the flag anti-Farage vote out in such a high-profile election. But I'm sure that if it doesn't go that way, there will then be someone on the left who will say, oh, well, Labour Party are doing fantastically well, actually, blah, blah, blah.
Yes.
And I think that will be worth pushing back on, because there's been a remarkable consistency in the polls of Reform being some length away. Perhaps they have stalled, but the overall trajectory, I think, remains much the same.
Yes. Last week in the courts, the activist group Palestine Action managed a victory against the government. The government had previously proscribed them as a terrorist group. Yvette Cooper, when she was Home Secretary, judged that the evidence was sufficient to proscribe them after they'd launched 3 attacks in UK. It has to be said, principally attacks on property, though people were hurt during those attacks. Shabana Mahmood was only too happy to uphold and to stick by that policy. But the courts, in the person of Lady Victoria Sharp, overturned that judgment. They said that the government's act was unlawful. There was a lot of rejoicing from Palestine Action and its supporters, and a determination from Shabana Mahmood as Home Secretary to revisit that judgment to ensure that the organisation could, if possible, be proscribed. That decision comes against a backdrop of what can only say, I think, Maddie, is increased agitation from Palestine Action's fellow travellers. Everything from Matt Lucas, the comedian, obviously, who's associated with Little Britain, who's Jewish, being harassed on the tube for allegedly not supporting, Palestinian rights, through to door-to-door canvassing in Brighton and in Bristol from organisations that wanted people to sign up for a campaign against Israeli goods. Am I right in thinking, Maddie, that the combination of these events, and of course they're all discrete in their own right, is a sign that Islamism and Palestinian activism and hard left activism together are resurgent, and our government just don't know what to do?
There's many things going on here. You've got the kind of long-standing Islamist-inspired anti-Semitism. Alongside it, there is this perhaps newer form of far-left activism, and often there's considerable overlap between those two families. But I'm struck by the moral absolutism of these people. They believe that the ends justify the means, basically, that it's perfectly acceptable to do some of the kind of interferences with people's daily life that you've described. And also, there have been very recent cases in Notting Hill, for example, a Jewish restaurant being targeted. Note how often what they're targeting isn't explicitly Israeli, it's simply Jewish. In the olden days, they were a little better at using the word Zionist interchangeably when they might have used the word Jew to give plausible deniability to anti-Semitism. But increasingly, they are saying the quiet bit out loud. And I think that they've conceptualized the conflict in Gaza as part of a kind of almighty struggle between good and evil, in which they're on the side of good. And therefore, literally anything they do can be justified with great moral fervour, including in the case of the guy that followed Matt Lucas home. That's interesting because Matt Lucas is a Jewish comedian. I don't think he's ever intervened to say anything about Israel. But
no, I don't think he's got taken any sort of political stance at all.
The fact that it's fascinating to me that the man that is harassing him in public would view himself as the goody, and he would say, well, there's a genocide, so this is fine. But actually, often what they're doing is not explicitly illegal in the case of Matt Lucas, I suspect, but it breaks down social norms that we've had for a long time in this country about basic civility. I think that, though, when it comes to the proscription, that's more complicated. I absolutely think that they should penalise the specific attacks on people and property, and I'm pretty disgusted that the prosecution for the people who invaded the Israeli Defence Company and attacked a police officer with a sledgehammer, and it's all caught on video, they were let off for that. I think that is astonishing and makes me genuinely worried about, the dispensation of justice in Britain. I also think that there is an issue with prescribing the entire group, because you have people who've engaged in none of that kind of behaviour that will then be potentially subject to arrest, including people who have probably quite extreme views but have not done anything unlawful other than holding up a placard. And that's why I think it was a big mistake. I also wonder why the CPS did not prosecute on terror-related offences.
Yes. So you're absolutely right to, I think, draw some important distinctions there. That doesn't mean that the actions that the government have tried to take are wrong in and of themselves, but I think that there is a spectrum, a range of activity here linked by common ideological viewpoint, which I think you're quite right, is fundamentally Manichaean, which holds that Israel has been guilty of, at the very least, war crimes, but certainly they would argue genocide in Gaza, and that in order to both protest against that genocide, but also to frustrate what they consider to be British collusion or support for that genocide, almost any action is taken. Mm-hmm. So the argument of a Palestine Action sympathizer would be, if you knew a genocide was happening and you did nothing, then you would be an enabler and a passive accomplice in an historic crime. But I, perhaps unsurprisingly, don't think that Israel is guilty of genocide. And I also think that if one looks at the actions that these individuals have taken, they are not either about, in most cases, a legitimate attempt to raise public consciousness about the issue. They are criminal damage. And Palestine Action were responsible for 3 direct, that we know of, assaults that led to criminal damage. One of those, as you quite rightly point out, involved swinging a sledgehammer against the spine of a woman. And even if in alleged self-defense, it's horrific. The related point about Palestine Action is that even before their prescription, they were circulating material to their members and supporters on how to conduct criminal damage and criminal operations without being caught. It was basically a kit for aspirant activist action that was designed to cause damage to property, and if people got hurt along the way, so be it. So in dealing with an organisation like that, I think you do have to use the criminal law. I think the point of contention is whether or not prescription, originally designed for terrorist groups like the IRA and ISIS and so on, is the right answer. I'm inclined to side on the basis that it is the right answer, because you need to give the state the powers that it requires when you're dealing with an organisation that is setting out to use covert means to cause violence in this way. But I do acknowledge that perhaps a more finely tuned instrument may be a more appropriate way of dealing with it.
Yeah, I would tend to say that we should go after the activities and the actions rather than speech. And I tend to think in a free society, it is better to know what your opponents are saying and thinking and to allow them to express themselves so that we actually know what we're dealing with. Incidentally, I think Palestine Action has been given far too free a pass in some quarters, in part because of its name. I think it's a bit like one of those amorphous, nice-sounding names, a bit like Black Lives Matter, for example, that can be quite a mask for the often malign activities going on there. I do think that there's a crisis here of justice and democratic accountability, because groups like this are causing untold disruption to ordinary people's lives. I think many people are sick to death of the kind of disproportionate power that this wields in modern times. And in many cases by people who think of themselves in heroic terms, but are actually vain people who are stuffed full of their own self-importance. And when you see really shocking outcomes like the sledgehammer attack, but there are many other examples where there really does seem to be some kind of two-tier justice at play. All of this undermines any confidence that ordinary people have in the system. I don't really know what the right answer is.
Their defenders would say that Palestine Action, not like just stop oil, when they were gluing themselves to bridges and attempting to disrupt traffic, and undoubtedly causing a huge amount of chaos and distress, were actually just in the tradition of the suffragettes, and were in the tradition of those who saw an injustice, believed that if the state wasn't going to act, then they needed to raise the stakes. Do you think there's any validity in that comparison?
Well, I think the suffragette comparison, I always think is a bit of a red herring, because I actually don't think the suffragettes were that instrumental in giving women the vote. I think probably what had more to do with it was the female labour force participation in the First World War and the advocacy of peaceful groups like the suffragists. I'm sure there are many people that would disagree with that, but I think you could argue that the suffragettes' activities, delayed the ultimate outcome.
Yes.
I mean, that's a bit of a point of historic pedantry. I think that it's a very dangerous slope to go down, because almost everyone could find a cause that they believe affords justice on their side. And if we are going to take the view that basically anyone that really believes something very strongly can do whatever the hell they like, then as a society we're in quite a dark place.
Yes, that's very wise. I do tend to agree. I think, like you, I'm always wary about any curtailment or circumscription of free speech, that adults should have the right to consume and to generate and to share whatever material they feel comfortable with, provided, and this is one red line, there's no direct violence as a consequence of that. There's no direct incitement or instruction to violence. So I do share that general working assumption. However, knowing from my own experience in government, there's an area between vigorous speech and direct planning of terrorist activity, which is extremism. And one of the things that I wrestled with was trying to ensure that other organs of the state could know if an organization was extremist, so that on that basis, there would be no excuse for giving them public money, giving them a public platform, allowing them to operate as though they were just another civil society group. When I brought forward those proposals, entirely understandably, there were a lot of people who were concerned that what I was trying to do was to circumscribe speech. That wasn't my aim or intention. And recollecting what happened then gives me sympathy for the position that the government finds itself in now. And in particular, when it came to the court judgment, to be fair to Victoria Sharp, she acknowledged that Palestine Action's activities certainly brought it within the ambit of the government definition of a terrorist group. But there were technical reasons, some of them related to the European Convention on Human Rights, that meant that she felt that the manner in which the prescription had been issued was unlawful. So it provokes two questions. One, is there something short of being a terrorist group that should imply that the state can impose restrictions on activity of some kind, or certainly flag up in lights what the danger is? And secondly, and this concern has been raised by the former Labour staffer Paul Ovenden, whether or not you or I might agree with the prescription, Parliament voted for it. Why should it be the case that a judge, no matter how eminent, should use the ECHR to overturn a democratic judgment of Parliament?
It's kind of ironic that we now have a Prime Minister who himself was part of this legal apparatus for many, many years, and is the most blobby, lawyery Prime Minister we've probably ever had.
Right.
And he still finds himself imprisoned by these same rules and strictures in which he operated for many years. He complains that he pulls a lever and nothing happens. There's all these mechanisms that can delay and thwart democratic attempts to impose legislation, whether it's judicial rulings, but also judicial review and endless challenges. It does lead to that question of who is really in charge. It's fascinating that everyone, no matter of what political persuasion they are seems to reach this conclusion whenever they are anywhere near the levers of power.
Yes.
But the trouble is, if you say, I don't think this is an ideal state of affairs, then you are liable to be kind of labelled some sort of populist or even a fascist, like, our courts are independent, how dare you have this opinion?
Totally. I think you're right that he's hamstrung by it. You're right also that it's because he's in the grip of an ideological viewpoint, a faith in human rights and a particular variant of due process, which he often alludes to, but which only Richard Hermer in the government has actually been brave enough to articulate. And I profoundly disagree with it, but at least Richard Hermer is out there making that case for the Matrix Chambers, Doughty Street worldview. I think that's wrong. I think that people like Paul Ovenden, who stress that Parliament should be supreme in these matters, is right.
Yes.
The Commons and the executive together should be right about it. But talking about ideology, there's a missing thing here, which is that if you go about saying, I'm going to prescribe that group, I'm going to prescribe this group, and you don't then also match the hard measures to restrict their action with an open account of why you think they're wrong ideologically, then it really does look like the worst sort of authoritarianism. So you're just shutting down critics without making the case. And here is the key weakness in the government's part. Why is it that Palestine Action should be countered? And that's where it links directly to those people who are going door to door in Brighton and in Bristol. The government should be pointing out.
Absolutely.
These are hard left nutters who hate the West, who've used anti-Semitic tropes in order to try to make Britain's relationship with Israel, Israel's defense of democratic values, our own strength and confidence in our traditions somehow toxic. So, throw in a bit of decolonization theory, cite your Edward Said here or there, put on a keffiyeh. You are a fighter for justice.
Yeah.
And against that, the government doesn't attempt to make any real argument. And that is the fundamental weakness. There have been Labour politicians who've tried that, but unless and until they do push back, then the toxic tide of hard left, anti-capitalist, anti-freedom, anti-Western, anti-Semitic activism will only grow.
Also, what you cannot have is just very obvious different rules applying to different groups of people.
Yes.
You can't have it be the case that a convoy of men can drive around Jewish neighbourhoods in North London shouting, F the Jews, rape their daughters, and it be considered, not that big of a deal. People are not stupid. They do notice things.
Yes.
And if the more evidence like that mounts up, the more there is simply no faith in the system whatsoever to deliver any kind of justice. And I think it aggravates tensions between different groups of people, even though I think in some cases the authorities feel that maybe if they are a bit more lenient to certain groups, that will make society more cohesive. I think it's the exact opposite happens.
It is definitely the case that if you appease sectarian sentiment, you only get more of it. And also, if you don't fight back, you will find that there are individuals, like those who were convicted in the Northwest last week, which was actually a success for our justice system. You had guys who were planning an atrocious series of events against Jewish people in the Northwest.
Yeah.
This, of course, follows on from the Heaton Park Synagogue massacre. Stephen Watson, the Chief Constable of Greater Manchester Police, probably our best copper by a long way, was very clear about the threat to Jewish individuals, the Jewish community, and law and order overall. You have one of these guys on film being asked about his allegiance to ISIS and saying, yeah, of course, ISIS are Muslim, I'm with them, they want Sharia, the people who don't want Sharia, who are not ISIS, they're not proper Muslims, in effect. Toxic ideology leading to a direct terror threat way beyond that, which we've just been talking about with respect to Palestine Action. But what did we have from government? What have we got from government? There's Keir Starmer saying, he's going to root out anti-Semitism. But there is no government minister who's explained why it's arisen, what the nature of the danger is, how to take it on. And in particular, to say that this was being incubated on the far left. We know that there are people on the far right, there are ethno-nationalist, white supremacist figures in the UK, just like Nick Fuentes in the US, who traffic in this sort of stuff. But the requirement on people in power with a responsibility to uphold democratic values to have a go at this is absolutely critical. The problem that we face in dealing with democratic values is not Elon Musk. The problem is the ideological nature of what's going on in our streets, even to the point that you have Carla Denyer, former leader of the Green Party, out there helping these people in their campaign against Jewish goods and Israeli goods. And yet it's regarded as somehow sort of, cuddly activism of a kind that you can look on like an indulgent parent, thinking, oh, well, this is what young people do. Call it out.
And you can also be damn sure that if a far-right thug commits an act of violence or vandalism, they're not going to have a load of famous KCs.
I'm tempted to say to any criminals listening, if you want to evade jail, then A, acquire a keffiyeh. B, get one of those black, white, green and red flags. Slap that on your jacket. And then whatever act you're committing, theft, GBH, fraud, just make sure that you say, this is for Palestine, as you're committing the crime. And then you can guarantee that you will get A, the best possible legal representation, and B, favourable coverage from Owen Jones and everyone else. So for anyone out there, for any ordinary decent criminal who's wondering how they can carry on their activities, then Palestine Action wants to hear from you.
I'm just quite tempted to just diddle my taxes and say it was for Palestine. Another case that is actually being, I think, heard later today is the story about the man who burnt a Quran in public. And he is, I think, a Turkish dissident who was protesting the Islamism of President Erdogan. And he was also, while doing this, attacked by a man with a knife.
Yes.
And there's a video of it, who it seems might well be intending to kill him or at least severely injure him. I think the man with the knife was already tried and he got a suspended sentence for it. As I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I haven't been following this case massively as closely as I should perhaps, but he was initially acquitted and now I think the CPS is contesting the case at the High Court later today.
There's an attempt to reinstate the conviction for a religiously aggravated public order offence. Well, I mean, the first thing is, I would not recommend, and I do not approve of people burning holy books, or burning any books, actually. I think, just as a matter of good manners and civility, it's the wrong thing to do. However, it's the case that if you are going to create religiously aggravated offences like this, what you are doing is reinstituting some form of blasphemy law, and you're doing so at a time when the government is contemplating a definition of Islamophobia, and many of those engaged in shaping that definition are people who have been either sympathetic to or blind to Islamist ideology or Islamist ideologues or organizations in the past. So I don't know everything about Mr. Koskin's case, the Turkish gentleman involved. He's written for us in the Spectator, making an eloquent justification of his actions, and people can make their own mind up about that. But whatever criticism one might level at him, I think it's also the case that it's completely wrong that this guy should face prosecution for a religiously aggravated offence. That is, once again, I'm sorry to use the phrase, but you did introduce it and you were right to do so, it's two-tier justice.
Absolutely. And the case with this man is also, I think, complicated by the fact that he chose to burn the Quran in front of the Turkish consulate.
Yes.
So I think, you could argue this is very overtly political.
Yes, that's right.
But it's really fascinating to me. Again, I wouldn't say everyone should go around burning holy texts, but it's fascinating how if you're Palestine Action and you want to be political, for you, politics could be something like bashing in the spine of a female police officer.
Well,
that's clearly politically motivated. But a guy standing in front of the Turkish consulate and actually not harming a single person, that's now a public order offence. And it's really sinister, I think, how they're using public order as a kind of proxy for essentially blasphemy law that we've not had in Britain for some time. And I wish there would be more honesty about what's really going on here. I
Yes.
saw a Muslim commentator responding to this, I think perhaps when the charges were first brought against this man. And she was arguing that it should be seen as a public order offence because of the disruption that we have seen historically from when, for example, printing any likeness of Muhammad has led to civil unrest, rioting, and
Yes.
it's even people murdered over it. Isn't that a shocking, outrageous framing of what happened? You know, that easily offended minority of Muslims react violently to free expression. And then that petulant overreaction is described as a justification for suspending freedom of expression.
My
Like,
religion
it's
is a religion
completely-
of peace.
Yeah.
And if you disagree with me, I'll knife you.
It's a kind of weaponized victimhood, but actually deeply aggressive. And I couldn't believe that people are using such justification. It's kind of very it's Orwellian,
Yes.
paradoxical. But this is kind of where we are. And I think it's being not so subtly echoed in legislation and the application of justice.
Yes, you are, I think, correct to draw attention to the fact that in the first instance, while I have a very old-fashioned pussycat aversion to people burning books
Well,
and burning,
so do I.
burning holy books.
I agree.
No. But
I just don't
nevertheless-
think they should be killed for it or
No.
imprisoned.
No, exactly. Nevertheless, this was a specific act outside the Turkish embassy, exactly as you say, which was intended to make a political point and should be seen in that context. I think the other thing about this case is if the attempt to secure conviction again is successful, there'll be a broader chilling impact on any of the criticism, whether theological or political, that people might want to make of Islam as a religion or Islamists. And I think, in particular, when you've got a situation with local elections coming up, in which there will be a number of people who are standing, including in your home city of Birmingham, that will be explicitly campaigning on an Islamist basis.
Yes.
This creates another challenge. We know that there was Islamist intimidation at the last general election, directed towards Jess Phillips, Shabana Mahmood, Khalid Mahmood, and a variety of others.
Yes.
So, it was directed against Labour politicians, both non-Muslim and Muslim. And now you have this guy, Shahid Butt, who was jailed, albeit in Yemen, for some pretty grotesque offences, who's now running as a candidate. He's presenting himself as some sort of community
Fantastic.
activist.
It's great, isn't it? Just fantastic.
And there is a risk that in
all
Birmingham...
very normal here in Britain, right?
Quite. That in Birmingham, that you could have maybe one of the largest groups on the council, if not the largest group, being composed of self-styled independents who are, in fact, Islamist or Islamist adjacent. Maddie, it's a very special anniversary that you're writing about in The Spectator this week, a centenary that we should all celebrate.
Yes, I'm writing about Kenneth Williams, who's, I think, one of the funniest British people ever to have lived. And I think a great talent. He's obviously best known for his roles in the Carry On films, which are hilarious and which we will get to. But he's, I think, really multi-talented in a way that is often underappreciated. He wrote these magnificent diaries in which he's sometimes can be very waspish, but also very insightful, very reflective about 20th century Britain, what it was like to be a gay man during that time. His politics are interesting. He was an avowed conservative who admired Margaret Thatcher. And there was a real independence of thought that I don't see that much in the world of acting and the creative side of things. But apart from anything else, he's just unbelievably talented as a comic performer. His extraordinary command of language, both in the language that he uses and the way that he deploys, he can change his accent at a whim, which is actually something a lot of the Carry On cast have. Like the way that, for example, Joan Sims can switch in a film like Carry On, Don't Lose Your Head, which I rewatched when I was trying to write the piece. How she
Set
can,
at the time of the French Revolution.
Yes, exactly. And actually it's surprisingly sound and based. It's very clear which side of the French Revolution the filmmakers are on. Joan Sims is extraordinary, the way that she can flip between a kind of fishwife accent to like a member of the aristocracy. And Kenneth Williams does something similar. There are some remarkable interviews with him on talk shows and things during the 70s and 80s. He died, I think, in 1988, but he was often on panel shows. And it's amazing his ability to impersonate and switch from one accent to the other. I think he's a genius.
He is. The carry-on genre is, I think, now generally derided as an example of bad taste and low-budget slop. But not by me.
Well, they're wrong.
They're completely wrong. So people would probably argue, sort of the general view, I imagine, would be that, there was great British cinema in the 40s and 50s, but then we descended into the twin skewers of schlocky hammer horror, and then the carry-on films in which you had sex double entendres, the camera lingering over Barbara Windsor's embonpoint, and then grotesque puns being enunciated by closeted gay men in a way that was designed to reinforce every terrible stereotype out there. Actually, what Carry On was a reinvention of the music hall and pantomime genres.
Yes. Using
a team of actors who'd grown up both in the tradition of rep on stage and therefore playing to a huge range of audiences every night, and also who had grown up in the great tradition of radio comedy as well, because Kenneth Williams, came to prominence through the Home Service brilliant comedy series Round the Horn with Kenneth Horne. So you had people who were inhabiting a very British tradition, who were supremely talented and hilarious. Put your blinkers aside, and whether it is Carry On Doctor, Carry On Cleo, Carry On Up the Khyber, which I think is probably the jewel in the crown.
Yeah.
They're all, I think, brilliant pieces of ensemble acting. And I defy anyone who has a genuine sense of humour not to enjoy them.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And I actually think that, contra their reputation, the jokes are actually implicit rather than explicit.
Yeah.
But some of the difficulty for the makers of Carry-Ons was that they were trying to get their jokes past the censors. And sometimes they would deliberately include jokes that were really risque and out there, knowing that the censors would definitely reject that, in the hope that that could become a cover for some of the kind of maybe like the moderately smutty jokes that they had. And I think actually, contra their reputation, they are best when the jokes are implicit, not explicit. When things really go to the doldrums, or when you have like overt smut, like Carry On Emmanuel, Carry On England, Carry On Behind.
Oh, yes.
That's not when they're firing on all cylinders.
That's the final descent.
The thing about the double entendre is that they couldn't get any actual rude words in, so everything does have this double meaning. But that is itself, you might say it's childish, but it is clever.
Yes.
And I like the way that it assumes that the audience viewing is both dirty-minded and intelligent. And isn't it interesting that in Kenneth Williams you have somebody who is a working-class comedian who is, I think, overwhelmingly interested in entertaining people, using art to entertain, not what we so often get now, where the art becomes a mechanism by which you clobber the audience with your opinions and to impart political messages. They're often very overt and not at all subtle.
Yes. So, it is absolutely right that alternative comedy, as it was termed in the 1980s, was reacting against both what it saw as the sexism of a generation of stand-up comedians like Bernard Manning and others, but it was also reacting to an extent against the carry-on music hall tradition, which it considered to be trafficking in stereotypes and so on. But actually, if one looks back at the craft and the wit of those involved, they were every bit as funny, if not funnier, than the successor generation. Also, they were operating at a time when you had the slightly more hoity-toity upper middle class comedy of Cambridge Footlights and Monty Python, taking nothing away from that.
And Beyond the Fringe, and
The carry-on films were both, exactly as you say, broad in appeal, but more sophisticated and knowing than people might now assume. And also in Kenneth Williams, I think you're right to single him out, a performer of genius, because as well as...
Who, by the way, could do Thesp. He did some really high-end theatre earlier on in his career.
Yes, and also...
People assume that because he's best known for Carry On, that he only operated in that mode. It's nonsense.
Anyone who's listened to him also on Just a Minute, the BBC Radio 4 game show, which relies on verbal invention and skill as a performer and creativity and wit, will know that he wasn't a one-trick pony. He was a genuine entertainer of genius. Also, as you say, quite a tortured soul, someone who was capable in his private life of great acidity, but also melancholy.
Yeah.
I don't know if Kenneth Williams were living and working now, if we would have domesticated him to the extent of making him a sort of, national treasure, or whether he would remain acerbic. But you can see strains of Kenneth Williams in everyone from Stephen Fry to David Williams to even sometimes in the dryness to a David Mitchell or a Lee Mack.
I couldn't agree more. I do think the British comic sensibility always has this darkness from its earliest roots. It's there in Malvolio at the end of Twelfth Night when he's kind of suffering in great misery, and as he's carted off stage, all the other characters are celebrating, It's there in, I don't know if you're a Gilbert and Sullivan fan, but in the character Jack Point from The Yeoman of the Guard, he ends that, which is otherwise comedy, by killing himself. And I think you have a direct line from like Malvolio to Evelyn Warren Starkey to Kenneth Williams, and then all the way to Peep Show to David Brent. I mean, compare the famous comparison between the US and the UK office. The US office has to be in a kind of major key because I don't think Americans are ready for the darkness of a David Brent.
That's true. That our David Brent is so wince-inducing and so tragic that even though the way in which he's written and performed is designed to forfeit sympathy, you can't help but have sympathy with him. But also, you're right, the sense of that exquisite, almost bowels turning to ice embarrassment at someone's behaviour being caught out is also caught by the David Mitchell character, indeed by the Robert Webb character in Peep Show. And I'm sure that, maybe the Channel 4 commissioning editors responsible for Peep Show would bristle at seeing them as part of a lineage which included Carry On. But I actually think that they should be flattered.
Two great examples are Steve Pemberton and Reece Shearsmith from The League of Gentlemen, but also Inside Number 9, which is clearly, there's one episode of Inside Number 9 which is clearly an homage to Carry On Screaming. It's called The Harrowing. They are obviously steeped in the Carry On tradition and the campness, relatedly with the Hammer horror. I think that the lineage is actually, it's perhaps more, it's more pervasive than people realise.
Yes, I think there is looming over the laughter a sense that we are smiling now and chortling now, but there is the skull beneath the smile.
Yes.
And that ultimately we must remember that the caperings of the jester Yorick end up with him in the grave. And so the tragic element is never too far from the comic.